Welcome everybody, we're going to get started. Hi, my name is Jeremy Cohen. I'm the director of the Honors Program here at SVA, and so lovely to welcome you here on this 1st of December night. Tonight's event is part of our monthly lecture series called the Art and Politics Lecture Series, co-sponsored by the SVA Honors Humanities Program and the Visual and Critical Studies program here at SVA, where we invite scholars, activists, intellectuals, artists, critics, and more to speak to kind of art and politics in the face of crisis. We have plenty of crises in which we face in our moment, crises of democracy, crises of the economy, of the climate, of kind of, in some sense, the future of our deepest ideals, and crises of kind of the rise of the far right and fascism. And so with the Art and Politics Lecture Series, we aim to see where art and politics, the delicate filaments that tie them together, and how they can speak to each other and offer resources in a time of troubles. We have a pamphlet up here with the remainder, with the next year's schedule. You're welcome to take one on your way out. Meantime, also, I will send around a sign-up sheet. This is especially for students, but for those who are not students, if you're not on our list, feel free to check off over here. I can make sure that you get added to our list to find out about future events. I will pass this your way, sir. Thank you. So without too much further ado, I'm really eager and happy. This is a long-awaited second collaboration of the Art and Politics Lecture Series with the Fritz Ascher Institute. And I'm really excited and thrilled that we're able to do this again, and want to introduce you to Rachel Stern, the director of that organization, to tell you some more about the Fritz Ascher Society, and then to introduce our speaker for the evening. So let's please give her a warm welcome.
I'm not sure my voice carries that far, but thank you, Jeremy, and good evening, everyone. I'm grateful also to you. Thank you for this second collaboration. This event fits very well into our lecture series, Fight or Flight, Stories of Artists.
Use the microphone, please. Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. 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 So this event fits very well into our series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. However, most of them are held virtually, and you can find out from our website when these events are happening and can sign up to the newsletter. Our Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, for Persecuted, Ostracized and Banned Art focuses on artists whose stories are not known because they were persecuted by the German Nazi regime. Our work centers on the years 1933 to 1945 in Germany, when the totalitarian National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party, governed the country. We examine how this regime reshaped the cultural landscape, restricting artistic expression, silencing creators, and endangering lives. By studying these histories, we aim to support contemporary artists in understanding the resilience, vulnerability, and power of creative practice in times of political oppression. Today, you will meet an insider who will speak about resistance and art, the Red Orchestra anti-Nazi resistance group in Berlin. The group is now officially recognized by historians as the largest and most diverse civil anti-Nazi resistance group. He will explore the visual art and resistance of 3 members of the group. I'm honored to introduce Stefan Roloff, who is an independent artist and filmmaker working in Berlin and New York. In 1984, he was invited to experiment on prototypes of digital video and imaging computers at the New York Institute of Technology, where he produced videos with Peter Gabriel and Suicide. He received a 1989 fellowship from the New York Foundation for the Arts for his pioneering digital work, which has been shown worldwide in museums and galleries. In 1997, he began work on his second documentary film, The Red Orchestra, a portrait of his late father, Helmut Roloff, a resistance fighter against the Nazis, which was nominated Best Foreign Film 2005 by the Women Critics Cycle. For some years, the subject of resistance remained a driving force in Stefan Roloff's work. He created video portraits of 80 dissidents from former communist East Germany, resulting in a series of installations. Among other works, he's currently working on a project about the smashing of monuments and a graphic novel-style feature about the Red Orchestra. Welcome, Stefan Roloff.
Anyway, thank you for coming. Thank you to Fritz Ascher Society for inviting me and to SVA for hosting this. And now we have to see the first image, which is actually this one. Okay, the story that I'm going to tell tonight starts in this room, which my father took me to when I was about 12 years old. And as you can see, there's a guillotine in this room, there's a basket where heads could roll into, and you also see meat hooks for hanging people in the far end. When my father took me there, and I was 12 years old, of course, to me this was strange, and people were commemorating something, and I didn't know what it was. And clearly also my father had difficulty expressing what this was all about. So to me, I reacted with disinterest. I didn't want to hear anything about it. This was something that related to the past, to the Nazi time, and this Berlin that I grew up in, this West Berlin post-war, you know, a lot of you were growing up as a child in a society where people had not taken a stance in time against things that had happened. And now all these grown-ups were confused and they had to deal with what happened with them, that they didn't say anything or they didn't do anything. So most grown-ups that I saw in the city were aggressive, they were cranky, they were in a bad mood, and I didn't want to have anything to do with this. Everything, this whole thing was like a dark cloud that was over us, over the whole city. And instead of asking my father questions, all I thought about really was, how can I get out of here? So I finished school first, then I studied art in Berlin at the Berlin Art Academy, and as soon as I was done, I moved away. I moved to New York City, and I stayed here. And for 30 years, I did nothing but paint, and I never looked back at this story until one day, inevitably, it caught up with me. And this was when I guess I can just do this, right? Let's see. So during sporadic visits that I would do maybe once a year, I saw that my father was aging. And I knew that eventually, or shortly, it was just about a matter of time, he would die. So somehow this room that we had gone into when I was 12 came back up to me again. And by now I'd heard through the grapevine that he was, had been part of the resistance and he had been arrested by the Gestapo. And so of course, the main question on my mind was, since I knew that the Gestapo basically killed everybody they arrested or could get their hands on, how did he survive? And to find out about that, I decided that I would do a media portrait of him. I would film him on video and I would ask him these questions. However, you know, I didn't know much about it at that time. I knew nothing. So I went first to get some background information. I went to the Resistance Memorial Foundation, which is a museum in Berlin, dedicated to the resistance. And I met the director, and he said to me, this is a very important subject, it hasn't really been covered yet, you gotta do this. And then he really, to my great dismay, he gave me about this high a pile of books, which, I wasn't really prepared to read, and less so to analyze and contextualize. So, but I had to do it, and I basically had to reprogram my brain from having been a painter to suddenly becoming not a historian, but to be able to understand the language of these people. So I started reading this, and I found out that my father had been part of a group that was labeled the Red Orchestra. This was done by the Gestapo. They have no name. But the Gestapo decided to label them and slander them as spies. A spy is somebody who's being paid, so it's like bad already in their eyes. So and how they came up with the name Red Orchestra was a spy who operates Morse codes as a pianist, a group of spies as an orchestra, and if they're communists, they're red. That's how they did that. Well, in reality, this group was very diverse, and they didn't have any name. Many of them didn't even know each other. So, and what they did was, they just were not willing to be bystanders. They did not want to see the government taking increasing liberties, reducing their freedoms, and they did not want to see deportations and witness deportations without just standing, while just standing by. So they decided to take action. So anyway, by this time that I found out all about this, I also had found more people. There were very few survivors of this group. And also, there were members of families, people whose siblings or other relatives had been killed. And I was able to take up contact with them, and I was really diving into my father's past. And I filmed these people, but then there was a problem that I had, which was they were very old, and they would speak with long pauses in between, or they would think, or they would look for words, and it was very difficult. It would have been virtually impossible to edit this. So I needed to find some images that I could put over this to give this a smooth flow, just filmically. And up until then, up until the time that I'm talking about when I did this project, which was in the late 90s, people had used reenactments always for something like that. And I felt that was, in this case in particular, would have been in very bad taste. I didn't want to do that. Imagine you're talking to somebody who's faced death or whose relatives have been murdered, and then you have this reenacted by actors. That was just not something that I could do. So then I came up with an idea, and the idea was that in the early 80s, I had invented a way of setting my paintings in motion by filming various phases that they would go through during their development, and creating movies out of them. So I thought that I could use something that is not an animation technique, but something where you would have something, a thing that would resemble a moving drawing, perhaps, or a moving police drawing, or something like that. So I started, I will show you an example. And the example is about one of the clandestine activities that this group did, which was that they would go out into the street and post little signs that they would stick on displays, on billboards or whatever. And to not be obvious while doing this, they posed as lovers. And here's the first.
Die gingen immer zu zweit, also meistens ein Mann und eine Frau, so als Liebespärchen getarnt, und die Mädchen klebten die Zettel.
So that was my way of dealing with something that there was no archival material about. I did this about things that happened in prison, but also actions like this that happened in the street. And what these people did was they pasted, for example, little simple signs that would say something like hunger, lies, Gestapo, which was Hitler's secret police, how much longer? And this was meant for people to start thinking, just passers-by in the street. And now you have to realize, creating stickers was not an easy thing. I mean, today you could go into a store and have a sticker done, but back then that was not possible. So they had a little set that was made for children with a stamp to create words and to learn how to read and write. And they would use that because also they had to be careful that their handwriting wasn't recognizable. Equally difficult it was to get paper for leaflets, and they did a major leafleting action. And it's amazing that, I mean, if you went to a stationery store and back then and you would say, I need, let's say, more than 5 sheets of paper, the clerk would look at you and they would say, what do you need this for? Why do you have this? And people were always careful and rightfully paranoid about things like that. So the leaflets that they sent out, it's amazing that they managed to send over 100 leaflets out to different people, and these were many pages long. And they sent them by mail, and we can
Ich fuhr dann mit der U-Bahn bis Kielplatz.
So as you can see, this guy takes a subway. He goes somewhere far away. I also filmed it in present-day Berlin. Well, present day is now like some decades ago, but it was like in 1998 perhaps, because I figured that this was something that was going on always in some form or another. So I did not look for a historical set. I thought it was best to show it in the current and contemporary Berlin as it exists right now. So when in these leaflets, what people would write was something like, for example, Napoleon already tried to attack Russia, and he got stuck in the snow. So think about it. You're not going to do much better. They wrote to the German people. And these they sent to very select people. They sent them to people who they hoped would multiply these papers. They asked them, please copy this, which would mean that people would rewrite it back then on machines. And they would also say, they would send it to Hitler's people, to the Ministry of Propaganda. They also sent it to Hitler's own brother who lived in Berlin. And this was to make these people paranoid, to think how many of these papers are out there and what is going on. So that was that. And now we're going to bring up a picture. Okay, some of you may know who this woman is. It's Mildred Harnack. She was an American who, and this is her last picture taken of her in her life because she was executed on Hitler's personal orders so that she would never go back to the States and tell the story of what she had experienced. Mildred met her husband, her German husband, at the University of Wisconsin, and then they moved to Berlin. And they moved there before the Nazis got, unfortunately, elected in a democratic election. So then her husband, when things got more and more dangerous, he said to her, look, you gotta leave. You gotta go back to the States. You can't stay here. And she said, no, this is my place. I'm here with you, and I'm gonna stay. And she knew what she was risking, and all of these people were knowing what they were risking. And what's interesting is that Hitler, with a stroke of one pen, he also ordered for 10 other women to be killed. And some of them were just as old as 18. And they have done nothing but post little signs in the street, as you saw before in that video that I showed. So this also shows the diversity within this group. There were 40% women, which is unique in the history of German resistance of that time. The oldest person arrested was 83, the youngest was 16. There were artists, there were government employees, there were aristocrats, there were whatever, common laborers, anybody you could find. The political spectrum went from left to conservative all the way. All different types of religions were represented in there. So it was not anything, and that really freaked the Nazis out because they always thought that they could categorize something, and this one they couldn't categorize, and that's why they invented this idea of them having been a spy network. Anyway, there weren't that many people. Now that I tell you it's the gamut of society, you would maybe think these are a lot of people, but there weren't. The Gestapo only arrested about 100 people, and that's a sad number. It is very small, and it shows you something about the willingness of a population to take a stance. So when they were arrested, half of them were killed right away, and the other half was killed in prisons and concentration camps, one way or the other. And a very few survived. And then there were also a few that were never caught. And for that we need the next picture. This is one of them, and now I will tell you about 3 artists that were not, and the way how their work reflects their experiences that they made. This is Mieke Bontes van Dijk. She's about probably 20 years old in this picture, and this is right before the arrests began. And what she did was, and this will also show you that resistance doesn't all have to be like serious theoretical work or political work. They did something very different. So these were her sister Cato, and 2 other friends who were also girls of that age, more or less. One day they noticed that French prisoners of war were transported on the public train system in a special car. And they decided to take up contact with them. Can we get the next one? So what's unusual about Mieke is that she documented what they were doing right then, which was dangerous because that was evidence. I mean, if that had been found. But she felt very compelled to do this. And so what you see here is you see the platform of the train, you see an armed guard, and you see the French guys, they're there. And of course, it's from the point of view of these girls, and they are looking at them from afar first and seeing them. And now we take the next one. Thanks so much. So now we're down. You see 2 girls are talking to them. But what's also interesting about this drawing is you see a couple standing there, they're ignoring it, there's a train conductor. It's sort of like this whole situation of the population that ignores what's going on, and then the other, which is, you can do something. So what they did was, they started exchanging letters with these guys, and they flirted with them. They took up eye contact. And she said this was a lot of fun. This really got her out of the whole depressed thing of everybody just being told what to do. And also it was forbidden to have contact with foreigners. And this was another very, very good thing for her, was these were French. So they were foreigners. And she could communicate with them. So they would write letters to each other. And they would exchange these letters secretly. And one day the French said, one of the French said, or communicated by letter to her that she should destroy these letters because if they were found, she'd be in hell for that. Well, she didn't do that. And the reason why she survived is, and why also the letters and these drawings survived, and why she never got caught, is that 2 months prior to the arrests, she got very sick. She went to the countryside to stay with her mother. She put all these letters in a bottle, and she buried the bottle in her yard in the countryside. And she was never caught. Her sister, whose name was Cato van Beek, who we'll hear about in a minute, died under the guillotine that we saw in the beginning. And Mitya would have had the same fate just for doing something like that had they caught her. So she got ill. That was her luck. That's how that happened. Anyway, she documented it right at that time and right in the moment, which is totally unusual, and it's kind of unique. There's somebody else who also documented what they did, but they did it a little later. Next. Okay, so here in the middle, sitting, we see a 15-year-old boy. That's the next artist we're going to talk about, Rainer Küchenmeister. So at this point, he's not an artist. He's 15, and it's about a year prior to his arrest. Like I said, the youngest person arrested. We see a couple of people here in this picture. This man is a sculptor. This man is a writer. That man is a writer. And she's a doctor, and she's kind of his stepmother because he's a street kid. He's not somebody who was raised among intellectuals. He was raised in a working class district, and he was, accordingly, he was tough. So when he got arrested, he was not impressed. The Gestapo guy, he thought he could impress him by putting a gun in front of him on the table, and he had seen guns before when he grew up in that district of Berlin. A gun was not so unusual, so he wasn't impressed, and the Gestapo guy was really mad at him. And that's why he said that he would get a prison sentence. And so he was first in prison for a while, and that phase I will talk about. And later he was sent to a camp, but he survived. So when he got into prison, and he was 16 years old, because, as I said before, there were 40% women in this group, and this was unusual for the time and for these people. They couldn't deal with that. So they had cleared a whole tier in the prison and put all these women up there. And the cell above his was Cato van Beek, who was the sister of Mitya, who we saw before, who did these things with the French prisoners of war. So Rainer, being 16, they would start talking with each other. And there was something else that I mentioned before, and that's very important, but I mentioned it in passing. Most people didn't know each other that were in this group. So these two never met and never knew that they had been in the same group. And the reason why that was done was so that if you get caught and you're in an interrogation, you can't give anybody up. So for that reason, he didn't know her. But they started talking, and he loved the sound of her voice. He described it in detail to me, and he fell in love with her. He was like 16. What was he going to do, being a boy with this woman's voice up above? And she was 22, much too old for him, and she had a boyfriend, and she didn't, but she felt it was very important to keep him alive because he was a young man, and she didn't want him to be killed. So they would talk, they would whisper to each other, sometimes they would exchange little notes that for some reason she had like some string, and they were able to write to each other. And then he never saw her. So he didn't know what she looked like. And then, he even tried, one day they made a date because she had to go to the dentist, and he looked through the people, but he only saw her legs on the upper tier walking by. So he never saw her. So then, when she got her death sentence, and it was clear that she would be executed at the age of 22, that's a very short life, he was really mad, and he wanted to beat up the guards. And she said, "You can't do this. You have to live. You have to survive. You have to tell a story. And then she said, you have to promise me something. 2 things. Survive and look for the beauty in art. Become an artist. You gotta promise this. He's a sweet kid, and he says, sure, what's he gonna do? But he kept his promise. And after the war, as I said, he was put into a camp, but he survived. Actually, what he said is one important detail I felt was, he said that she had helped him, she had shown him how to survive in prison. And he applied the same thing when he was in the camp, because he said, if you're ever in a situation like that, the only way you can survive is if you help somebody else who's with you. This is what she had done with him. So when he, after the war and after things settled down a little bit, he became a painter. And he became actually not any painter. Einer Küchenmeister, he was twice in Documenta. So he wasn't, his art really rose, but what did he paint? So he has a very different way of dealing with the past. Because in his case, he paints it after the fact, which is, I should do this, or yeah, okay. He painted only people without heads or faces. Let's look at these for a moment. And I think there's one thing that's interesting that Einar said officially within the art world. He didn't say that he was portraying what it actually was that he was painting. He was giving them a different concept. He said, faces lie. You cannot paint a face. You might as well not do it. And that's how he explained why he was doing this. But in reality, we know now why it was, and that's because I spoke with him about his whole becoming an artist and everything, and he explained that to me. Yeah. All right, so here are 3 other people. On the left, you see Kedo Bontes van Beek. I just talked about her. She was the woman who was in the cell above Einar Küchenmeister, who communicated with him, who told him to become a painter, and who also was executed at the age of 22. This photo was taken on a street in Berlin, maybe months before these people were arrested. Middle is Heinz Striedel, it's her boyfriend, and on the right is Katja Marowski, and she's the 3rd artist that I want to talk about today. So Katja has a very unusual story because she was Jewish, but she managed to hide that from the Nazis. So they did not know that. And she thought that she could survive by hiding that because nobody really knew how bad all this stuff really was. And she wanted to stay in the art school. She was in the art school. She didn't want to be kicked out because they were starting to kick out Jewish students just for being Jewish, so she did not want that. So she hid this from them, and it was very good that she did because later you will see why. And she knew Kedo, and together they had something that is similar to the Underground Railroad. They were just hiding people, and they would just move them from one place to the next until they could persecute people, persecuted for a variety of reasons, until they could hopefully get out of the country or stay somewhere unknown. But one day she had a bad experience. And these are her, she also, like Mitya, who I showed first, she kind of documents what happens. But she does it in a different way. She did it afterwards, and it kind of shows very, like more psychological situations, I would call them. So here she is in the art school. She's looking for somebody. In the back are art students, art professors, hard to tell who it is. And what happened was, one day she and a friend of hers who was a sculptress, and she was her best friend, whose name was Nixon, as you can read down here. They were coming back from being in the countryside, and they looked good, and they were like tanned and everything. And there was the student leader of the art school who was very conformistic with the regime and the system. So he went up to these girls, and he'd had a crush on Katya already. So he felt kind of rejected by her, and that was a bad thing. So he said, "Oh, you're looking good. Why are you so tan?" And she said, "Because I've been in the countryside." And he said, "Oh, aren't you supposed to be in the factory making bombs for the war?" And she said to him, "For this war?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Hell no." And she said, "Sometimes you make a mistake, you just can't help it." It was like intuitive, it was emotional. She said, "Hell no." And then he looked at her friend, Nixa, and he said, "And you?" And she said, "Absolutely, no." So he said, "Okay, I'm gonna have to report you to the Gestapo now." So, you know, this is within the art school. This is very interesting. And so then they both had to go for an interrogation. Now, Katya's father had told her, "If this ever happens to you, don't forget, these guys are nothing but men. Make yourself look good, and you might slide through." So she put on her best dress. She put on lipstick. She took her portfolio of drawings with her, and she went to the Prince Albrecht Street, which was the Gestapo headquarters, and in there she was interrogated by this guy, who within a short while developed a major crush on her. And so he, and the interrogation ended up with him giving her his phone number. And so now she knew she had him, because how would he ever explain that away? So he let her go. But the problem was her friend Nixon never reappeared. And so she did these 4 drawings, washes they are, and they're on about letter-sized paper, that I'll show you first, where she is back in the art school, and she's looking for Nixon. Here she is, the art students are in the background, they're hanging out, they're looking cool, but still, she doesn't see Nixon. It says, "Here she always was," question mark, up above. She opens the door to her studio. You see an easel in the background. You see an empty room. Nixa is not there. Here she walks again through the art school. She's asking herself, where the hell is she? You know, people are sitting in the background studying art or smoking. Nobody really pays attention. And here she goes into art history class. It's funny, you know, like you see God and Moses up above. And but still, a mass of anonymous students, but not Nixon. That's how Katya dealt with that, but it was very, very difficult for her. And that's when she said to me, like when she reacted like that with the student leader, she said it was a big mistake. So we have to be also thinking that these people knew. You cannot always just say it out in the open. Sometimes you have to do it clandestinely, and you have to do it carefully. Somebody asks you a question, you just answer it. You might get in trouble for that. And it might not be you, but it might be the person next to you, and in that case it was her friend who she lost through that. Oh, by the way, the student leader became quite a successful artist. He looked like a hippie. He had long hair afterwards, after the war. So he he did well afterwards. Nobody ever asked him what he had done during the Nazi war. This is a drawing washed by her that I particularly like because it shows yet another act of resistance, but it's a different one. So she said one day she was walking with a friend who was also an art student in Potsdam, which is sort of a suburb of Berlin, and it was Hitler's birthday. And so everybody had to be home. The streets were empty, and you heard his voice because it was broadcast on the radio. So you heard his voice coming out loud into the streets, and the streets were lined by these swastika flags. So Katja said her friend, the other student, he got really mad and he took one of these flags and tore it down, which he could do because nobody was looking. They were all inside listening to their leader. So Katja rolled up the flag, took it home, cut out the swastika, and tailored herself a dress for it. And this was, of course, so this is before after. That's what that picture says. And she said that she wore that dress when she first met Cato Bontius van Beek, who was the woman who helped Rainer become an artist, and who we saw before in that image where the three of them are walking in the street, because Cato saw her in the art school with that red dress, and she said, wow, you look like the revolution in person. That's how that happened. And here, this one, she said one day she was walking with a friend of hers in the street, and a Nazi came out of the subway, but he was by himself. Usually they come always in twos to say, these types of people, they never see them alone. But this one was alone, but still he made some comment about them. Made some comment why they weren't like in the gas chamber yet or something, at least that's what she writes there. Fact of the matter is, Katja got really mad, and I can tell you from knowing her, that's the way she was, and she started attacking him. And she beat him, and she said he ran away. She couldn't deal with that. And her friend stands in the background, and she's kind of scared, and she says, oh my God, Katja is so radical. But that's what she was, and that's what she did. And so, as you can see, all these are situations. Now, we're going to look at this picture one more time, because Heinz Streeter, the one in the middle, Cato's boyfriend. One night, there's a knock on the door in Katja's studio, which, oh, by the way, her studio she also used to hide people in. She had a studio at the art school. She could sometimes sleep with friends, and so she hid people. And this is, if you study the Red Orchestra, which I can only give you the tip of the iceberg in a talk like this tonight, you will see almost everything defies your prefabricated opinions about how people work, how situations work. Here you got a Jewish woman who's hiding persecuted people in her art studio in Berlin. This is amazing. Anyway, this was one night where she was by herself in the studio and painting, and there's this knock on the door, and it's Heinz, and he says, Cato has been arrested, and we gotta just disappear because they're coming for us next. So the two of them walked out into the street. It says, try a smile, girl. It's her and Heinz, and they are walking through Berlin at night, hoping to find a place somewhere where they could hide or crawl under or whatever. And I think this says so much. You got these anonymous gray people in the background, you don't know who they are. You have this feeling of paranoia, who's gonna rat you out, what's happening. You've got the prison car, which takes you away to prison, and you've got the police precinct in the background. So these two are just walking, and they are looking all night, and unfortunately, they never found anybody. Would go too far to explain this whole thing, but what they experienced, but in the end they decided we gotta split up. So Katja, her parents were hiding in Poland. Her mother was Jewish, her father was non-Jewish, but he was a communist, so they each had a reason to be hiding outside of Germany. And so she went to see them and to stay with them. And she endured the war in that way. But Heinz was murdered, and he was, along with the other that I was talking about before. So then, in 1945, the war was over, Berlin was in shambles, and Katja returned to Berlin. And so what she did was she kind of looked for the people that she had connected with before, her fellow art students from before the war, or from before that they all had to hide and escape and everything. And she found them again in this ruined city. And now you have to imagine, this was a city, there's no art supply store. There's nothing where you could go and you could get brushes even or whatever. You had to kind of invent and make everything up. And so it took them a few years, but before the 50s, I think it was 1949, Katja and these other art students created what I in my studies is the first and only in the 40s in Germany performance project that they did, reacting to what had happened before. So they would do evocative things. She always said, we don't do daily politics. We don't comment specifically on things. We're going to do things that evoke a feeling. So here you see the audience of the cabaret. That's what they called it. It was called a cabaret. And somebody is performing death by hanging. Now, from what I told you before, people being hung by the Nazis and all that, and killed, that of course raises a lot of bells. And here he is, the way that it would look from the audience's point of view. Then they did another thing, which was, there had been degenerate art. Like art that the Nazis said was not art anymore, not considered art. So Picasso was one of them, but there were many, many, as you know. And so they would perform 3D paintings that they set in motion, which was amazing. Look at what the materials are. Cardboard, black and white paint, stuff you find basically in the street. Some rags, whatever, they built these. Then they did another one that was Miro. And this one is actually, we can kind of get a feeling what this looked like because it's called, it's a painting by Miro, it's called The Spanish Dancer. And there are 3 pictures, so flipping back and forth through them, we can get an idea of what it was that they were doing. So they basically, also what she said was this. She said to me that the Weimar Republic, the time before the Nazis took over, had been the freest times of all, in terms of art, in terms of how people were producing things and everything, also multimedial art and everything. And she said she wanted to bring that back in some form. She wanted to do this again. And so, being able to do this was kind of a triumph. She felt that she had overcome what these people had forbidden. And there were survivors. Of course, they also did some things that are pretty descriptive, even though she said to her it was never just that moment. It was more a phenomenon that she had observed. A henchman cutting people's heads off and So you have to imagine all of this in motion. You know, people weren't able beyond those 3 pictures I showed you before. And this one is Katja herself, and it's her way of showing how her dearest friends have been beheaded. It's called The Woman Without a Body, and she just had it looked like her head was resting on a box. And she did this sort of like a circus act. There was somebody next to her and said, talk, you know, and then she would like recite a poem about this. And that's how she dealt with it. And I think that kind of, to me, that's an incredible image about how do you deal and how do you transport an experience that you've had into an image that says so much and so much more at the same time. All right, there's a friend of mine in this audience who asked me to not forget to say how my father survived, because in the beginning I said that was the reason why I first started analyzing this. So we've seen these 3 artists. First survived by getting sick. The second survived by surviving through the help of Cato, who was in the cell above, and surviving the concentration camp that way. And the third, Katja, who survived by hiding out with her parents in Poland for the last years of the war. So my father wasn't somebody who could escape or anything. He was in Berlin. But there was one thing that the Nazis didn't know about him. And that was many years before. So when he was going to study, he wanted to study piano because he was a musician and he wanted to play piano. My grandfather, his father, said to him, "You're not going to make a living with that. You better study something that's real." So he kind of forced him to study law. So my father became a lawyer, and at the time that the Nazis took over, he was interning in a small court in Germany, and he went to my grandfather, who was also a very staunch anti-Nazi, and he said, "You can't expect from me to study, to work in the law under these circumstances." So his father said, "All right, you can study piano now." So he paid his piano studies, became a pianist. When he was arrested, the situation was that they found the worst piece of evidence at his house that they could have possibly found, which was a radio transmitter, which is basically what the Nazis built their theory that they had been a spy group upon, but the radio transmitter didn't work. There were also other evidence at his house, like letters from Jewish friends who he had been helping, and they were like communicating about how this could go on. So, but the Nazis, the Gestapo who arrested him, they didn't see that. They thought, wow, we got this radio thing here and a suitcase, who knows what's in it, whatever. So they took it and they took him with them. And during interrogations, because he was a lawyer, but they didn't know that. They thought he was this artist, idiot, basically, didn't know anything. They could not fathom that he was following a strategy, and his strategy was threefold. First of all, he said, how can I say something that sounds believable and with which I don't give up the others? And this was his main mantra. The second thing was that he knew that he could not deny the fact that this suitcase was in his apartment, because the guy who had given him the suitcase had been arrested before him. And he had already told the Gestapo that the suitcase was at his house. Which is why they were dumb. They shouldn't have done that. But they came in and they said, where's the suitcase? I mean, obviously they knew it was there. He says, oh, that's here. And the third thing, how he survived, but there are two other reasons for that, is out of his own doing, was that he thought during interrogations that these people, if he just said he knew nothing, at some point they would get suspicious. You know, how can you not know anything? That's like kind of strange. So at one point he said, "Oh yeah, I think, I always thought there was something wrong with that suitcase." So the Gestapo interrogator was all like thinking that no, he had him. And he said, what did you think? And he said, "Well, you know, the guy who gave me that suitcase, he's a dentist. And, we're living in times of famine. So a dentist must have a lot of patients out in the countryside, outside of the city. So from the weight of it, I thought there's probably apples in there." So at that point, the Gestapo guy thought this guy is lost. I mean, he's just dumb, and he's not going to deal with it, you know. So the other reasons were two. One was his friends never gave him up. None of his friends gave him up. Of course, the guy with the suitcase, they beat him severely, and his Gestapo mugshot shows that. He had to tell them where the suitcase had gone, but he didn't tell them that my father knew anything about it. And the third was kind of a terrible reason. There was a young woman who was arrested, and she was 18 and she had a baby, and the Gestapo said, "We can do all sorts of things with your baby. If you don't tell us the truth, if we catch you with one lie, it's going to be your baby." So this woman told them everything. She gave up her husband, she gave up her friends. She had to do it. It's not even something that you could say, why would she do that? She had no choice. And then they asked her about my father, and she said she didn't know him, which was good, because like I told you, the group was kept apart particularly for that reason, so that people wouldn't be able to give each other up. So she said, so they said, "Well, do you think he knew what was in the suitcase?" And she said, because her husband had the suitcase before, and he had wrapped wire around it, and he had closed it with a padlock. And she said if he didn't open the wire and the padlock, he couldn't have known what was in there. So with that, because they were so focused on this suitcase, and because there was no Google that they could have checked that he had once been a law student, they really didn't find out about this. And so they had to let him go, because they thought this is just an idiot. He had to sign that he didn't talk with anybody about it, and they let him go. So that gives you a couple of situations how people got out, and the main topic of this talk, I guess, was the art and how these people dealt with what they had experienced through the art. And if my father hadn't survived, I wouldn't have existed, and I wouldn't be able to tell you this story today. So thank you for listening. So if anybody has a question, yes.
I have two questions, if you don't mind. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Two questions. When you said they were all arrested, was this in the beginning with the Gestapo, or the beginning of the war, or the end?
No, that was in 1942.
Nice.
They were people who had, most of them had been clear about this even before 1933, before the Nazis came to power. Some of them had been Nazis originally, or at least sympathizers with the system, and they had changed. So by 1942, it was already kind of a moment where the Nazis were a little bit paranoid about what could possibly be going on, because they weren't doing so well in the war, and that's when they got arrested.
Okay.
And that's why this was kept secret. Also.
Got it. And then your father taking you to that room, was that just to even if you didn't want to talk about it, was that just to show you without saying anything, for him to kind of relive it? Or were you was it on the way of going somewhere and he would just
No, I was, like I said, I was 12 years old. He took me to this place. The reason why, I grew up in a society of silence. People could not talk. It didn't matter if they were for or against it. And if you've ever read Maus, this comic by Red Spiegelman, you will know this. People who make experiences like that, how would you tell that to a pipsqueak? I mean, like somebody who's like 12, you can't. And even with your friends, and maybe they're not friends, maybe they were people, maybe all your friends are dead. Who are you going to talk with? In his case. Others had things to hide, perhaps, that's why they didn't talk. But, so his taking me there, I feel, I thought about that for many years. But today it feels like it was his inability to talk about it what caused him to take me at that age to a place like that without further explaining it. And that place is kind of like, at 12. Well, it wasn't even scary. It was like just odd. I didn't get it. That's what it was. Yep.
Yeah, this art is so important to us now. How much difference do you think it made during the Nazi era? When they were living through it, the resistance, did it affect anything?
Well, these people did their art secretly. They did not do it in public. So nobody could see that. Katja did her work either in Poland, where she was hiding, or after the war in Berlin. Mitya did hers, and she hid it in the bottle. Rainer did his after the war. So, and I mean, nobody can fathom something like that, really what it is. The problem, and what I said before in the beginning, you are complicit with something like that as a society. You don't do anything about it. People will end up like really terrible once this thing is over. They're going to feel bad, and they're not going to be able to deal with anything. And maybe art is one of the few languages that you could use, because even history writing back then, mostly controlled by former Nazis anyway, because these people don't go away, So how do you express yourself? You express yourself through art, through music, yeah?
So, does this art have much of a presence in terms of galleries and in teaching in Germany now?
No, I don't think so. The pieces, Rainer Küchenmeister had a major presence, like I said before. He was in Documenta twice. So his work was widely exhibited, and he had also famous artists like Anselm Kiefer that were his patrons. So he kind of did all right. And what's interesting about him is he only painted until he was done saying what he had to say. And then he stopped. He wouldn't do another painting. It's sort of like Duchamp, who also came to that point. And then he sat in Washington Square Park and played chess. He said, that's it. I've said everything. Yeah.
Hi, Stefan. Thank you. That was fascinating and scintillating, very poignant. I'm confused. What did your father have to do with Katja and the artists at the school? Was there a connection there?
No.
I missed it.
No, there wasn't a connection.
No connection.
These people were from very different areas and fields, and some of them knew each other indirectly. Some of them, let me give you an example. My father knew Cato, but he didn't know that she was in that group. They only had common friends that they would sometimes be at dinners together. But they didn't talk. You didn't talk at these dinners about the way that you thought, because you could get killed for that. There was a guy who said something about Hitler at a coffee thing of his mother's. And one of his mother's friends informed about him, and he was executed. So, I mean, you didn't talk in moments like that. So they had met, but they never, so when he was in prison, he could send her a message. They had a way of sending secret messages. Katja, he never knew. And other people, they all, some knew somebody, but most of them were. Yeah?
Did your father know the hard acts, though?
Did he know
Did he
what?
know the harness? Because if he had the transponder,
Did he know, I'm sorry.
did he know like Arvid and Mildred Harnack if he had the transponder?
You know, it's funny, my grandfather knew them. Because before the war, they were in Gießen, in a small town in West Germany where there was a university.
That's where she
And
studied.
my grandfather was a professor there, and that's how they knew each other,
But not in the network.
but not in that context.
Okay.
Yes.
The artwork from during the war, where did you know it existed, or you found it after you started meeting these people? How did you find all this artwork?
Okay, so Rainer Küchenmeister and Mietje Bontes van Beek, the two people at first, I found because I interviewed her brother, who was not involved in this group and who lived. And so he introduced me to Rainer and his sister, who was still alive. So I could interview them, I could speak with them, and I could get their artwork directly from them. And then by a fluke that is really strange, and it would take another lecture to talk about that, I found Katja, because she was unknown. She was not in the internet, she was not in any books, she was not in any publications, but I found her by accident, and that's how I got access to her work.
I found the photograph most powerful because it looks like now. It looks like exactly like now. And one of the big issues that I fear is censorship and free speech. We're so used to having free speech in this country that people expressing that, if you look at the photograph, it's something that is so familiar. And these people live with monsters. And we're going towards that. And it's always confusing to me. What do I say? How am I affected? In the 70s, I rented an apartment as part of the train that would send draft strikers to Canada. I didn't know any of the people who did it. I only knew the one person who connected me to it. And one day the FBI arrived. But I didn't know anything. I still don't know anything. And the point is, that was necessary then to really help people escape the draft because it was very serious. But I have no idea how to act now. I think that people are really curious to do that. And looking at this photograph is a lesson for now.
Mm-hmm.
This is now.
But you know what you see, you know what I see in this photograph? I see three people that are smiling inwardly. They have a secret. They know that they're not part of this. And in whichever way.
Yes, I really truly understand that, but for me now, looking at this photograph, because I could go out the street and see this right now.
Mm-hmm. But you cannot have a system. There's no explanation for what to do. Everybody has to find that for themselves. What's important is that you don't get chiseled away by time and
Here.
yeah.
So the whole Red Orchestra is like these members who are holding these secrets, and they're part of this group, but they're not allowed to tell anyone, and they don't know about other members, about most of the other members of the group. How would people find out about the Red, like this organization? How would people know how to join this organization? And like, how would they communicate with each other, like secretly, without discovering each other's identities?
So the way they found out was very simple. Let's say I know you. For some reason I trust you. I'm connected to a network. I will tell you, do you want to work with me? Do you want to partake in activities? And you will say yes, but I won't tell you who my other friends are, so you can't give them up. You might also draw more people into that, the same way. But again, you know, you wouldn't tell me who they are, and probably you wouldn't tell all of them among each other who they are. That's how that worked. So it wasn't like a public thing, obviously. They would have all been dead before they could even start to work. It was a very private and personal thing, and really that is also the most important detail about it. They were just friends, you know? And of course, you know, 6 degrees of separation, if you think about it within a society, the next person that you know might already know people that I have no access to. And the same with me for your people and so forth. And so that's how that traveled so quickly. And yeah.
Art Spiegelman had this comment once about when he had his son, and his son gave his son this gift. His gift was like this giant monster. It was kind of a reflection of the kind of the big unspoken secret. Do you think it's like taboo to talk, like still taboo to talk about, you know, things like the Red Orchestra and stuff?
Well, it's always taboo to talk about things that are illegal. And it depends on the time where it shifts what's illegal and what is not. So at some point it could be like, yeah, you know, wow, you know, and the next time it could be, you come with me and we're going to go into this room and nobody's ever going to see you again. So you don't know which situation to catch this in. Yes?
Do you have any information about how many people were in the Red Orchestra? I mean,
Yeah.
And from when to when did they operate? From what year to what year did they operate? When did it start?
Yeah, so the only number that we have is the people who were arrested. They were about 120, more or less. Then there were their friends, like Mitya, who was not arrested, like somebody my father knew who was not arrested. There were people, but their number is unknown. But thinking about it and thinking about the realities and thinking about the danger that they put themselves, I mean, think about Mildred Harnack, whose mugshot I showed before. She's American, she's got the chance to go back. Her husband is pleading with her to go back, and she doesn't do it. So how many people have that mindset to be that committed?
Small number.
Very small number, very, very small number. And yeah, that's, I hope that answers. Yeah.
So millions of Germans supported Hitler. Millions of Americans are supporting an authoritarian regime. They're not the same. What are your thoughts from living with and studying all of this about the moment that we're seeing now?
It was like deja vu. And, you know, for many years I thought this. I would, you know, the best photograph that explained to me what this was all about was a photo that I would always look at and share with people, and it was of a group of people happily sitting in a cafe on Berlin's main boulevard having coffee and cake at the time that, in secret, but still, the Red Orchestra arrests began. So I always thought this is what bystander apathy is all about, and this is what this photograph kind of says. But I'm wondering about today, you know, it's like we're sitting in cafes, we're having dinner, and people are being abused, so it's complex. And suddenly, it's not like a historic image anymore. It's like something that's happening right now. It's, yeah.
I just wanted to thank you for this amazing talk, and also I appreciate the how a lot of the figures that you mentioned were art students at the time, and speaking in a room of a lot of students who are also currently studying art. So with that in mind, I was wondering if you had any thoughts or sentiments, especially as mentioned, sitting in a room with a bunch of art students on you know, young people being in, you know, making art in the largest scheme of things, especially because a lot of the artists you mentioned did things secretly or, you know, hid things in bottles. And with a lot of artists nowadays tying their the value of the art with, you know, with numbers and audience scale, if you had any regard to that.
Yeah, well, I can tell you, and maybe it sounds like a cliche, but it's the way I have worked. Follow your inner voice. Don't worry about the market. Don't have people tell you, you should do 10 more of this, or you should do that. You know, you wanna like become famous, you could do that, then you do what I just said, or you want to really produce something of lasting value. In that case, you will follow your inner voice, and you're never gonna submit or compromise with what people tell you. And it's again, it's up to everybody which path they want to take. Yep.
Hey, Stefan, thank you so much. One was a question, and in looking at this and getting to know this, mainly to get ready to hear you tonight, one of the things that's really interesting is how many unnamed and named organizations there were in Belgium, in Holland, in France. Short question to that is, in your research, what part of the international, there's the people that take over radio stations and people that are getting people across borders. In your research, does that come into play with the artists? That's part one of my question. Part two is, have you been to the Norton and spent time with the Norton Dodge collection at the Zimmerli?
No.
Because that's 23,000 pieces of Soviet dissident art that an American acquired and then kept it hidden for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of great stories about how city to city and district to district people were doing it. So the fun fact and question.
So the international connection was only one. Like I said in the beginning, there were government higher up government employees in there that were secretly, being anti-Nazis while they were carrying the party bag. And there was also a high military officer in there, and in particular those two, one of them was Herbert Harnack, he was Mildred's husband. And these two guys took up contact with foreign embassies. The Americans, the Russians, they were looking for more people, and which then was interrupted by the arrests. And they didn't do that to be spies, but just to help supply them with information that would help to end the war as fast as possible. So that was the only way to get rid of these people. They were too tight. They had too much of a stronghold. So then when they were arrested, when the Soviets entered the war, they gave them a radio transmitter and said, we have to leave Berlin now. You got to communicate with us. But the thing never worked. That was the problem, there was a problem of electric current like this. Yes, exactly. And so for that reason, that never happened. But once the arrests happened, the people in Moscow thought, why aren't we hearing from these people? So they sent somebody from Belgium to go to Berlin, and that's ultimately how they got arrested. Because you would think they got arrested because they were doing all these street actions. No, they didn't. They only got arrested because some idiot in an office somewhere in Moscow sent addresses of 3 people, and it took the Nazis a year to decode that, and that's when they could.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. Another question, I'm surprised that when you visit Berlin, they have tax money that build a Widerstand museum.
Yeah.
People want to get to know about the previous government's leaders. And they also get money from outside of Germany that they want to know the strategy, how to sign, how to do the communication and so forth.
I have no idea. I mean, I find this question very interesting because I don't know if you read that book, Cast, by a woman called Wilkinson, and she wrote an essential work where she compares 3 situations of terrible past of oppression. One is the caste system in India, one is slavery in the United States, and the third is the Holocaust in Germany, which is the only one of those 3 that is really like kind of within it's over. And what she said, and I don't agree with that, is how great it is because the government funds this in Germany, that they put these signs everywhere, we should never forget and we should know and all this stuff. But these are empty words. What good is that, I mean, it might be good to do it, because at least it's something, but anyway, it's within, all of this is within the ways of how a government would support something like that. my work I've mostly done independently because I think it's important also as an artist, I work independently, so it's like that. Yes?
I was very interested in performance artists because I had read like concrete artists, concrete poetry, really excited to, after the end of the war, to get back. But who attended her performances? I mean, this is a
Who
city.
attended what?
Who would attend her performances? This is a city that doesn't want to recognize.
Yeah, I'll tell you who that was.
What had happened.
I'll tell you who that was, because she was very smart. She did that thing that some clubs in New York City have done. She wouldn't let anybody in that she didn't like. That meant everybody wanted to go there. It didn't matter who it was. So she would let people in who she liked, and she was very proud of one thing that she told me. She said Louis Armstrong was in Berlin. He was giving a concert, and he heard about this thing, and he came. And they let him in, of course. And he jammed with them on stage as they were doing their performance. And she felt that she had really overcome Hitler in that moment, where something like that would be able to take place. But that's who was allowed in there. It was her choice. Oh, actually, she told me, do you know who Klaus Kinski is?
Yes.
Okay, so Klaus Kinski wanted to get in and she didn't like him. and she said he came to her in a cafe and he was so mad. He said, I'm going to fight this table if you don't let me in. She said, go ahead, fight the table. And she wouldn't let him in. Anyway, that's, I hope that answers you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all.